Good morning. I'm Andrew Lansley and I'm the Strategic Counsel for Low Europe. I and my colleagues at Low have been preparing a report which we are launching and publishing today called Mind the Gap. What we mean by that is mind the gap between the UK and the European Union and the risks of the gap opening up over time and reducing the opportunities for trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union. To discuss the report and to bring forward their own perspectives, I'm delighted we've got an excellent panel this morning for the discussion, and I will introduce them in a short while. But first, I want to say a big thank you to my colleagues at Low for working on this report, and indeed to all of those whom they interviewed from leading organisations in Brussels and in the United Kingdom to look at these issues and to bring forward a report that examines it, looking towards the future. Now, what we're trying to do here is to say that British business, whatever its past relationships in Brussels, needs not to wait for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to deliver the goods. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the Partnership Council that is associated with it is moving slowly, and the whole system is currently somewhat bedeviled by a lack of trust, particularly in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And indeed, as we are discussing this morning, the debates about the Northern Ireland Protocol continue, and they continue to cause problems institutionally between the European Commission and the United Kingdom government. So don't wait around is our first message. The British business community has interests which actually are often very much aligned with the interests of other European businesses across the continent, because we're all interested in maximising the opportunities for trade in goods and services. The issues are not just about borders. And what I think is increasingly evident is that while the border problems have been significant and may continue to be, and the Partnership Council under the TCA will certainly try to minimise those differences and difficulties as time goes on, we run a risk of divergence growing in other areas as a consequence of the gap emerging between the European Union's regulatory requirements and standards and those that are adopted in the United Kingdom. Sometimes that is a deliberate choice. David Frost in July said that it was the government's intention to replace retained EU law and indeed to look at implementing some of the task force on regulatory reform in the United Kingdom, the implication being that this will be divergent from EU regulations that have applied in the past. So the British business community and the European business community need to work together if we're going to maintain opportunities for trading goods and services. Now, that means the United Kingdom is a third country, and the business community in the United Kingdom needs to operate in Brussels as a third country towards the European Union institutions. In the Mind the Gap report, we looked at the example of the United States. I'm delighted Susan Danger is with us from AmCham EU. We'll come to her in a minute. But we looked at the United States as an example with wide-ranging and substantial business interests and how they approached the lobbying and representational responsibilities in Brussels. And Susan will have an opportunity to talk about that. For us, we said, mind the gap is the problem. The gap may increase over time. Divergence of regulations may cause significant problems. But there are opportunities for dealing with this. It's not just the alignment of regulations. It's certainly not that the United Kingdom necessarily becomes a rule taker from the EU. And we know, for example, in financial services that there is no possibility of the City of London taking its financial services rules in future from the European Commission. But actually, there is a great deal of opportunity which has not been taken for the mutual recognition of standards. So, for example, Leslie Galloway is with us from the Ethical Medicines Industry Group. Nobody in the European Union is going to allow the approval of medicines that are unsafe. Nobody in the United Kingdom is going to allow the approval of medicines that are unsafe. The mutual recognition of those approvals could be a route to both sides having the regulations that they think are appropriate for their industries, but not necessarily impeding the opportunity for trade between the European Union and the United Kingdom. But the politics and the business interests are not necessarily the same. And the politics at the moment are moving toward divergence. The business interests look for mutual recognition and alignment. So what we want to do is to say to the British business community, you may not necessarily find your interests are represented in the way that you would want them to be by the British government in the negotiations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. You may therefore need independent representation in Brussels. And in the report, when we move from Mind the Gap to Bridging the Gap, and if you look at pages 25 and 26, when that moment arrives and you have it in your hands, we make a number of proposals for how this can be achieved. And we'll come on to that during the course of our discussion. But essentially, it is about the British business community working with their European colleagues, working with other third country representatives in Brussels, working with those countries directly who have the greatest bilateral interest in trade with the United Kingdom, such as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany, and ensuring that the business interest in Brussels and between the United Kingdom and the EU has a long-term impact on decision-making on both sides of the channel. So that is the proposition in our report in a nutshell. I do commend it to all of you to read, and we would very much welcome all of your contributions and responses, because we want at Lowe to feel that we are a part of this. We are a company based in Brussels, here in Brussels. We're a Belgian company, but we also have a group that includes a UK company. And I, for my part, of course, I am a UK parliamentarian. I'm in the House of Lords in Great Britain. But I want us as a European entity as well to be able to act and operate across the single market as well as in the United Kingdom. That's our objective, and we want to help others to do the same. So I'm going to come to our panel and I'm going to ask them for their responses in their particular areas. I'm then going to come to the discussion. And for all of you who are listening, please use our Q&A function to put your questions up so that we can keep the discussion focused on the issues that you want to ask of our panelists. We'll finish at 10, and before that, I'm going to ask our panelists also what would be their recommended priority action points. They don't have to be the same ones as we've isolated for proposals in our report, but I'm looking forward to hearing their proposals for action by the British business community. Let me come first, if I may, to Ben Butters as Chief Executive of EUROCHAMBRES. Ben, you see the business lobbying scene in Brussels. How is the UK's exit from the European Union and the new relationship we need to have, how is that changing the scene in Brussels?
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you very much for the invitation to Lowe Europe, and congratulations on the report, which I guess as a panelist have been privileged to have a sneak preview of. Contains many really valuable ideas and recommendations, and I think in a general term underlines the importance of a constructive dialogue between the UK business community, the EU policy institutions, and the EU business community moving forward. If I may, Andrew, before I look at things from a EUROCHAMBRES perspective, I'm also originally British and was involved for a number of years in initiatives to try and increase the UK business community's engagement in the EU policy-making process long before the word Brexit even was invented. And it's never been easy, actually. There's always been something of a gap between the UK business community and the EU policy-making ecosystem. Of course, there are exceptions to that. We have a strong CBI office in Brussels, and they're part of the Business Europe Federation. There are a number of UK trade associations that are very active at European level and similarly involved in European federations. But for some years, there had been, even before Brexit, a perception that the UK business community was punching below its weight at EU level cumulatively, I would say, despite those exceptions. This is kind of ancient history in some respects, but I think it's important to bear that in mind, and it provides some useful context when considering ways that we can avoid a widening of the EU-UK gap moving forwards. My second point would be to underline the importance, moving on now to my role as the CEO of EUROCHAMBRES, the importance to our members that European chambers and the millions of businesses affiliated to European chambers foster a strong, functional and constructive relationship with their UK counterparts. We're already seeing the effects of the new UK-EU relationship across our network. Businesses, particularly SMEs, of course, are struggling to adapt to new requirements, and those requirements themselves are not totally clear yet, given postponements in certain elements of enforcement and ongoing discussions about parts of the TCA, which are supposed to provide that certainty that we'd all been craving for so many years. So it's really important that that EU businesses get help, and I suppose it's the same for UK businesses as they navigate these new rules and checks. And this really, getting to my main point here, requires evidence, intel, data, and an exchange of those elements between the EU and the UK in order to tackle these problems. And I think that's underlined by the fact that today, in fact, the Commission is publishing a new report on implementation and enforcement of its free trade agreements, which underlines something that we've been saying for years, that trade agreements can't just sit on the shelf. They have to be actually implemented and delivered if they're going to have the impact that they should have. Obviously, the EU-UK agreement is quite different to many other EU trade agreements, but nonetheless, the aim should be the same in the interest not just of the UK or the EU, but I think in the general interest of the European economy, that we can try to make this trade agreement as effective as possible. And if I may, my final point, perhaps I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, Andrew, in the discussion, but I think really underline the importance that even though the UK is now rather inelegantly referred to as an EU third country, it would be a mistake for the UK business community to consider the EU in purely bilateral terms and to handle relations in the same way as they might handle relations with business counterparts and policymakers in other major international economies. Perhaps Susan has a view on this as well. I guess many people here today understand this, but of course the EU-UK relationship is unique in its importance economically, but unique in its history as well. So I think we need to find more different ways of engaging rather than purely bilaterally, and I think that's where organisations like EUROCHAMBRES can help. But generally speaking, we need to work together and with the institutions to make sure that this trade and cooperation agreement really minimises the friction. There will be friction, but let's try to minimise that by reinforcing our connections and our relations.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. That's very helpful opening remarks, very interesting too. Thank you. Let me come directly to Susan Danger, Chief Executive at the AmCham EU. As you know, Susan, we took the liberty of using AmCham EU as a model for how the British business community might collectively think about its representation in Brussels. But perhaps you could tell us more about your experience and what you would recommend to them.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Andrew, for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists. So let me get straight into it, because I was wondering how I could possibly condense a lot of information into just a few minutes. I'm going to just start directly with who we are, because that in itself is going to give some recommendations, I believe, and I'll finish with some more concrete recommendations. But AmCham EU is an organization of 158 US companies. I think the crucial words here, we describe ourselves as committed and invested in Europe. I think that's really important, because I'm going to come back to narrative afterwards. So we say we're the voice, we are the voice of US business. And actually, to your point, Andrew, importantly, some of our member companies, 25% actually are lawyers and consultants who are representing corporates, but they have to be representing corporates. So indeed, our companies also do use independent consultants a lot. Important also, we've been here for 60 years. This is not something that's built up overnight. This is a long relationship. Again, happy to answer questions on that. I think the other thing of note, characteristics about an organization like ours are that we're multi-sectoral, very powerful, and we're non-partisan. Again, happy to expand on any of this. And the fact that we're US companies only means there's no member state bias. So when actually you're interacting with stakeholders, it's very clear who you're representing. We don't have French or German or Polish companies, it's US companies. So I think it's really important to understand, because it's a model also that has worked, the fact that we've been here for 60 years doing this. Secondly, I want to say, why should we care anyway? I mean, you've covered it, you've talked about divergence of regulation, Andrew, but I think it's really important to understand, first of all, why should the US business even care about being here? Firstly, it's the single market, absolutely crucial. We have actually made the case for investing in Europe more than European companies themselves, which comes into another role that you can have in your toolkit, which is why it's 450 million consumers over here, world-class innovation and skills. There are numerous reasons why US business cares. The other reason also why we care is because of the EU-US relationship overall. I think that's important to mark, and maybe it relates a little bit to Ben's comment about EU-US leadership on all sorts of other global issues. So you can influence here also on many global issues. So, and finally on this bit, why do we care? Statistics and stats are so important. I'm going to give you one that we actually give to the other side of the Atlantic about why they should care, which we had to do during the Trump administration days, which is 55% of the global income of US companies comes from Europe. So my point here is that you have to have different messages depending on your audience. We have messages for the US side, but we have different messages for the EU, which brings me to the third point, which is, okay, we understand why the US cares about Europe. But the crucial point here is, why should the EU even listen to a third country? Why should the EU even listen to the US? Why should it listen to the UK? So you've got a big convincing job to do to convince the EU as why they should even listen to you. You can be as present as you like in Brussels, but it doesn't mean to say they're going to open their door. So why should they care? And I think that point is the stats, which is the contribution in our case of what US business gives to Europe: job creation, employment, the economy. Otherwise, why should the EU even open its doors and listen to you? So, for example, 4.8 million jobs are created by US investment here. So then you've already covered it, Andrew, and I know we don't have so much time on this, but I did want to mention the Brussels effect. The other reason why a third country should care is the Brussels effect of the global scope of regulation and how wide it impacts. I think that's really important. So maybe I've probably gone over my 3 minutes, Andrew, but maybe so therefore just throw out a few buzzwords here, I think, to finish up with what I would recommend. I was trying to nail it down to some letters, so I came up with some T's and some N's. So I'll throw them out. I think on the T's, trust is absolutely crucial. You've got to build up trust. You've got to be transparent. You need to be part of the team, whether it's the EU team, whether it's with other associations. You've got to build relationships. You've got to build relationships with other third countries. So you've got to be a team player. You've got to have a toolkit which is very varied of different things that you're going to do. And the final one of the T's is the tone. Big advice to the UK. You've got to get your tone right. The US doesn't always get its tone right. It certainly didn't over the last 4 years. You've got to get your tone right if you're going to have any headway. Then some N's for you. One is non-partisan. Disconnect from the UK. You have a good relationship with the UK mission, but you shouldn't be bound at the hip. Get your narrative right and your storytelling. nationalities. Shouldn't just be Brits here. Don't come over as a Brit and think everyone's going to listen to you. We have 24 nationalities in this organisation here, 24. Knowledge doesn't begin with N, but it sounds like an N. You've got to share that with your stakeholders, be a resource. And finally, my last N, Andrew, is an N for not. Do not moan. Do not be just a series of grievances, and do not just reach out when you need something. So finally, my recommendation is that business really needs to be convincing to show the EU that it's a trusted policy partner, and that the EU needs to talk to the UK. You need to convince the EU that the UK business is good for the EU. So I leave you with that, be a trusted policy partner. Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much. Those were two excellent opening discussions. Thank you very much indeed for that. That's great. In the report, we zeroed in on 3 sectors by way of case studies that are discussed in more detail in the report. So I'm delighted we've got 3 representatives from those sectors. Let's come first, if I may, to Ian Wright, who's Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation in the United Kingdom. Ian, can you tell us more about how the food and drink sector, which is so important, is itself thinking about not only the current problems, but some of the developing issues on regulations?
Well, thank you, Andrew, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Excellent. Just at the very moment you introduced me, a big thing came up on my screen saying unmute. I mean, the moment of panic that you have in this context is huge. Thank you for asking me too, because this is an issue which has been on our minds in the Food and Drink Federation, which is the largest body that represents food and drink manufacturers in the UK. But we're also, I should say, part of a kind of group of 4 organisations, including the National Farmers Union, UK Hospitality, and the British Retail Consortium, who make up the kind of primary first front line, if you like, of food representatives of the farm to fork food chain. And then behind it, we also convene a group of over 60 individual trade associations. All of those organisations have a real stake in this question of how the UK food and drink industry should represent itself in Brussels and to the wider European Union. And of course, it's an extremely difficult question to answer. And it's one that actually has been impeded by the raggedy nature of our withdrawal from the EU. So if you think of the way this has gone, the timetable, we decided to leave in 2016. And you might reasonably argue that we should have been thinking about how to represent ourselves post-exit at that point. And of course, we did start thinking about that, and we had quite a lot of conversations and discussions. But then the protracted nature of the exit and the question at various points of whether we would ever exit was one that really bedeviled those conversations. And then the actual nature of the exit, which has left us, you know, through, first of all, a transition period when we weren't in, but everything that looked like we were in, to the very late night discussions that came up with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on Christmas Eve, and then the fact that we're still not completely in and out because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, makes it extraordinarily difficult for organisations like mine to understand exactly how they should represent themselves. And then alongside that, you have the slight concern, and I know, Andrew, you will be familiar with this, you have the slight concern that by taking the initiative and placing yourself in Brussels, and by being a presence in Brussels, if you weren't already, you run the risk, if I can put it this way in the vernacular, of deeply pissing off the UK government, who are your major sponsors, because they have a particular view of those organisations who are deeply engaged with the EU. And on the other side, as I think I may have been quoted in the report, you have the problem that your European representative organisation isn't particularly keen on your involvement either, because it causes difficulties with the Commission and it ends up leaving you compromised. So we are thinking about this very, very significantly. I think at the end of the day, we will probably support, that our industry will probably support some sort of specialist food embassy in Brussels, which will bring together all of the organisations I've just mentioned. But we will also need to engage extremely closely with the rest of British business And that may be through the CBI, maybe through the Chambers of Commerce. My preference would be for a collective engagement, partly because there is safety in numbers, and partly because the scale of the necessary representation, which could replace what we had before, is going to be so huge that no one industry can really afford the kind of presence that will bring the leverage that we need. Andrew, back to you.
Ian, thank you very much. I mean, that's really interesting what you had to say. Of course, we know that the British government initially, when replacing what used to be permanent representation to the EU with the UK mission, quite correctly thought there is a considerable job of work to be done here and was scaling it up. Not least since it's budget day, we may find in the wake of the budget that many aspects of government administration are being scaled back. And indeed, there are some recent indications that the scale of the UK mission in Brussels is being scaled back. But the essence, I think, of what you were saying, and I think we very much agree with in our report, is that we cannot rely on the UK government to European Commission relationship delivering the messages and indeed the objectives that the British business community collectively is looking for. And so there will need to be the kind of representation I think, Ian, you were talking about, which is very helpful. Thank you very much for that. Can I turn to Leslie Galloway, who is Chief Executive of the Ethical Medicines Industry Group, who of course has quite a lot of, in the pharmaceutical sector, they're called medium-sized businesses. In any other sector, they'd be regarded as large businesses. But you represent quite a range of businesses on the pharmaceutical side, Leslie, and medicines is always very different. And the approval processes are a particular issue in pharmaceuticals and medicines. I wondered whether you might like to tell us a bit about how you see things developing, and in particular, with medicines, people often characterize us as leaving the European approval system and potentially joining the American one. Is that something which British business looks at with favour or otherwise?
I'm not sure about joining the American system, because the American system is very, very different indeed, but cooperating with them is very important. I have to say that Susan said a lot of things I was going to say, but it's not going to stop me. The pharmaceutical industry in the UK is very concerned about a whole range of issues. And just before I talk about those, it's useful to give a bit of a perspective of who we are. And you touched on it, Andrew. We have we're a small, medium-sized pharma predominantly, but those small, medium-sized pharma are actually sizable companies. They're simply small, medium, relative to the giants of our industry. 80% of our members fall into that category. 10% are the big boys themselves, and the remaining 10% are an interesting range of biotechs, often coming from the US, with medicines for small populations, cell therapies, gene therapies. So we have a very broad church indeed. We also give free membership to patient charities, because engaging with patient charities is a critical part of what we do. So we are concerned about a whole range of issues, from regulation, supply chain, through to the Northern Ireland Protocol. But what we must constantly remind ourselves of is the primary objective of the EU is to keep the EU intact and to grow it. This means the UK must not be seen to prosper from leaving. And that therefore should determine the method and tone. And it's interesting, Susan used that word, tone, of any approach we make to the EU. Also, we have the challenge of EU associations whom we work with may be wary of being seen to be too close to the UK, as they cherish their relationships with the Commission themselves. Whatever we propose must have considerable benefit to the EU. The EU will be primarily interested in what they need, excuse me, from the UK, and vaccines have been a very good example of that. We have much to offer the globe, but we need to keep the rhetoric to a minimum and focus on how we can benefit those we wish to cooperate with. What I like about the Mind the Gap paper is it's very pragmatic, a lot of common sense, especially in the 14 points. As it points out, we want to improve regulation in the UK, but significant divergence from the EU will present its challenges. What we need to focus on is making the UK attractive. So cooperate with the EU, but make ourselves as attractive as possible to inward investment. And so projects like, as you mentioned, the FDA, where we have Project Orbis, and the FDA is coordinating the review of approval of promising cancer treatments involving the regulatory authorities of 6 other countries: Australia, Canada, the UK itself, Singapore, Switzerland, and Brazil. And not all of those markets are particularly big, but this could be the beginning. So together with something called ILAP, which is the Innovative Licensing and Access pathway in the UK, started by the MHRA, that's continuing a pathway through towards the patient. And combined with the NICE Methods review that I sit on, actually, and the Innovative Medicines Fund will be launched by the NHS in the coming weeks, we're building that pathway all the way from regulation right through to the patient. And that's what companies want to see in the UK. They want to see the possibility or a clear view, have a clear view of how they get from regulatory approval, because it takes them 10 to 12 years to get that regulatory approval. It's a very high risk, high value investment. And then they've got around 8 years left of their patent life. And they have to get through NICE and then through the approval of the NHS. So it can take quite a long time to actually get it into a patient. So if we can implement something called the voluntary scheme better in the UK, where the industry funds any growth over 2% and pays rebates on a regular basis, quarterly basis, to the Department of Health, which go to the NHS. What we need is a bigger allowance for growth, because that 2% may have been okay at the time, but inflation is now over 3%. The cost of transport is going up. Everything is going up. And through COVID, the cost of APIs, the approved pharmaceutical ingredients, has grown as well. So costs are going up all the time for pharma, yet the pressure on prices are going down. And people often say pharma charges high prices. All they can see that's available publicly are the list prices, excuse me, and they bear no relation to the real prices that are paid by the industry to the NHS. So if we can pull a lot of things together, wire the system up a bit better, the UK can become a really strong force to be reckoned with.
Leslie, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to one or two of those things at the moment, but I do want to bring Helen in. Helen from the Helen Smith, Executive Chair of the Independent Music Companies Association, IMPALA. Obviously, we tend to think about the issues at the moment to do with the supply chains and goods traveling between the United Kingdom and European Union. But actually, a lot of it and the future is going to be much about service activities and the ability of people to move between the different jurisdictions. Helen, I just wondered if you, from the creative industries point of view, were already experiencing those issues.
Yes, indeed. We represent at IMPALA independent music companies who account for 80% of all new releases in music today. The main priority for us, as you say, is to focus on mobility, to focus also on questions like trade, simple questions. How do UK companies deal with VAT issues? We also have a very, I think, quite unique situation in the music sector, because a lot of our releases are naturally European. So we may have an artist living in Berlin, signed to a Belgian label. First release country may be UK, it could be another country. The UK is a fundamental market for all European artists who are looking to break, looking to get known elsewhere. And this is, we often talk about, you know, the perspective of UK companies as regards Europe, but in our sector, we talk also about the perspective of European companies as regards the UK, because getting your artists into the UK getting them to tour, getting them to perform at festivals, concerts, absolutely essential to breaking an artist internationally today. So within our organisation, we cover over 30 countries. So we're not talking about an EU-based structure in any event. So we have a natural progression to be inclusive. We are, I think, really interested in this report because, as Leslie flagged, it is really pragmatic. We also, I think, are really interested in the fact that, you know, there are some just simple, practical recommendations. We do not see in our organisation any question about whether or not UK structures would continue to be a member and participate in IMPALA. We see that that's reinforced. We understand that's also the case in other sectors where, you know, the spend of representation in Europe, in Brussels, has increased and will increase, and that's very similar to the specific points that are flagged about the need for UK businesses to be more present. And we heard from Susan about how we're talking about 60 years of presence and how that's paying off now. I'm also thinking of Scotland House, which I think has been in existence for 20 years. You know, again, you know, these seem perhaps soft issues or perhaps not really pertinent in today's tough corporate climate, but in actual fact, they create and they promote a soft relationship which is ongoing and is not just, you know, there when we need it, I think is what Susan also mentioned as well. And I think those issues are really, really, really vital in any kind of relationship. The other aspect that IMPALA is looking at, I think, remains one which other sectors are focusing on as well, is the need to really have a sector-specific approach. You know, whether we're talking about music, whether we're talking about performing arts, publishing, design, architecture, we are really, you know, we are in a situation where the cultural sector has been designated as one of 14 priority ecosystems, yet that's probably not really reflected in the trade agreement. You know, that's something that we all need to look at. And, you know, the kind of standard response, Brexit is Brexit, is you know, it's something which I don't think is acceptable either in the UK or in Belgium and Brussels. And we really look to decision makers to, you know, to take a review of the trade agreement in good faith and to consider, you know, what did we get wrong? You know, this is not a blame game. You know, what can we do to maximise trading relations? How can we move forward in a new way? I think that's a kind of rough overview of our position at the moment. There's another project that we're also looking at, which is to take a view of trade agreements in a totally different way. So we have in Europe today, you know, next week we will have COP26. It starts in Scotland. It is in Scotland. It starts on Sunday, and we will see a massive commitment, hopefully, from the EU, from all sorts of governments all across the world. And one of the main focuses will be reducing carbon, obviously, to reduce global warming. So, you know, we need to focus more on promoting local trade. So is there a need to review our overall approach to trade agreements? So there's I think it was Ben who mentioned that we're talking about, you know, there's a report out today about how trade agreements are actually implemented, how they're effected. Do we need to have a new approach to trade agreements? We're talking about, you know, possibly creating a new cultural area, which includes the EU, but also neighbours. And one of the big advantages is that we would massively reduce carbon when we're touring. So I just mentioned that it's quite a topical area, but it's really, I think, part of how we all accept a responsibility to see things differently as we move forward.
Helen, thank you very much. That's really interesting. And I'm very glad you raised the issues relating to COP26, because it's that between the United Kingdom and the European Union, there is an enormous potential for the two together to have a big impact on global attitude to decarbonisation. by the pace at which we achieve these things. But of course, the way we do it, in particular, for example, through the emissions trading scheme, if we don't do it in a coordinated fashion, we will introduce more significant barriers to trade. So finding ways of maximizing our decarbonisation, but at the same time keeping trade moving, is going to be a negotiating objective. And it's not one that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has yet resolved. It's in there, but it's not yet resolved. And of course, the British government, the first thing they did when they said we're going to have our own emissions trading scheme was to change the price. Now, they changed it in the way of trying to create additional pressure, downward pressure on carbon emissions, which is great. But at the same time, you sort of think, well, hang on a minute, should they have tried to keep it aligned with the European Union and shift the whole EU and UK emissions trading scheme in the same direction? And you mentioned, Helen, you mentioned the trade agreements. The British government is at the moment understanding in the new trade agreements that are coming through, for example, with Australia and New Zealand, that service sector issues, the ability for UK service industries to establish in those countries, for people to move there to work, the ability to come and go readily for work purposes. This is absolutely instrumental to future trade. And the question is, well, can we not create more of that that sense of the opportunities to move between European Union countries and the United Kingdom to work and to establish oneself and to trade there? That is the essence of creating a new trading relationship. So, but Ben, we're picking up questions on the Q&A, got quite a number there. Can I just direct to you one that Malcolm Harbour is asking about Norway? Because we could have looked at Norway, but I think it would have got rather complicated because of the European Economic Area relationship, which of course is not one that the United Kingdom presently has with the European Union. But do you see that the Norwegian approach, even though it's more focused, for example, in areas like energy and fishing, that nonetheless the Norwegian approach in Brussels has something to commend itself?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Malcolm, for the question, and hello out there. I can't see you, but I hope you're well, and it's lovely to see your name on the screen at least. Norway is in many respects a good example. I talked about punching below the weight in terms of UK representation, business representation in the past, and Norway, I believe, is the opposite phenomenon, whereby, you know, it's a small country, it's an important economy, but it's a relatively small country, but they're very active at European level in a clever way, complying with many of the T's and N's that Susan laid out earlier. I would say they're very shrewd in the way that they engage with the institutions and with business organizations. We have a member from Norway, and you know, they're not as active as our EU members, but when they spot something that's potentially of relevance to them, they will get engaged, and I think that's the key. And as Susan said, just being in the background and ready to contribute on other dossiers when they're not necessarily of acute importance to them also helps their cause when it does come to something that is really significant to them. So yeah, let's Norway could be a good example worth looking at. Yeah, there were a couple of other questions from me, but I tried to answer one in
yeah,
writing.
you did.
But,
there was one about the, I mean, EUROCHAMBRES is one of the leading business organisations in Brussels. You have third country chambers who are your members. So, and that has been true, obviously, for a long time. How does EUROCHAMBRES as an organisation integrate or distinguish between third countries and EU member state chambers?
So yeah, we have over 40 members. Each of those is a national chamber association, and you know, we can do the maths. They're not all from the EU, of course. They are all from Europe. So that's where, you know, the precise But borders are open to interpretation. Do we take the Council of Europe interpretation, the Eurovision interpretation, the UEFA football interpretation? We discuss that quite often internally, but nonetheless, our membership goes far beyond the EU. I mentioned Norway, but also we have members from the Eastern Partnership countries, from the Western Balkans, from Russia, from Turkey. So they're all engaged. We differentiate them in our statutes. I won't go into that now, but they are all actively engaged. They can all take part in our committees and contribute to our positions. Sometimes it's problematic, but 99 times out of 100 it isn't, which I think goes back to my previous point about not just EU PLC or UK PLC, but Europe PLC. I think everybody is more or less in the same boat, and most of our members from non-EU countries are either aspiring EU member states or have pretty strong relations with the EU, whether that's as part of the economic area or via a customs union or a similar arrangement. So yeah, it works 99 times out of 100, I would say.
Right. Ian, I wonder if I could ask you, because in the course of preparing the report, we talked both to you and indeed to Mela Fruin, the Food Drink Europe, and you're members of that. But I think both from you and from Mela, there is a sense in which it wouldn't be expected on the part of European Commission officials that Food Drink Europe would be representing the views of the British business community or the British food and drink industry to them. So how do you see this as you develop the relationship? This, because the British business community has to kind of be inside the European associations, but also have a distinctive and separate voice.
Yes, it's a complicated question, really, because of the ownership of major food companies across Europe. So if you look at my top 20 members, who very significant names that everybody would have heard of, Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, Pepsi, and so on, only two of the top 20 are actually UK listed businesses. The other 18 are either US listed businesses, European listed businesses, including those from Switzerland, or they're privately held in Europe or the US, for example, Mars. And that is a real complication, because it means that in this question, it's of strength, of course, in many ways, but it's a complication because it means those businesses are represented not just in FDE directly, because FDE takes the largest European businesses and allows them to be members, corporate members, but also in all the constituent organisations of FDE, which are all the 27 trade associations from within the EU, equivalents to FDF, plus as affiliate members, of which we are now, all the other European players. And so the truth is the Brits are in the room anyway. Because they're there in some form, either through the British-owned companies, the two I mentioned, or because we're massively overrepresented in Irish business, or in some form in the other big corporates. And the problem that problem, as I think I may have said to you, Andrew, is compounded by the fact that, bizarrely, in my experience, almost all big international companies are really terrible at communicating between Brussels and the constituent member organisations, corporate units elsewhere. I ran the Diageo corporate affairs team for 14 years, and we only got how to be represented in Brussels right in the last 3, which was a bit late, really. And the trouble is that they don't, not only do they not talk across Europe, but they don't always talk up and down in the way that you would hope. And that makes the representation through an organisation like FDE highly difficult, even if you weren't just deciding to exit the EU. And I think we have to be very single-minded. I come at this really from the corporate point of view. If I'm the corporate affairs person or the person most responsible for regulatory in either a Diageo or a Coca-Cola or a British company like ABF, what I need to do is decide at what level is it required for me to be represented in Brussels? And at what level do I get representation anyway from my constituent business units across the EU? And then I think I have to think that that gives me some kind of guide to the level of engagement I need with the FDE type organization and with the Commission and the rest of the EU, and what pressure I can utilize from the individual business units, which may be very influential in the 27. I realize that's not a terribly helpful answer, but it does, I think, lay out the sort of slightly complicated three-dimensional chess.
But I think it is really interesting, and I think it does point to a very important issue for British businesses to recognise the extent to which they are part of multinational corporations. There are all sorts of networks you can use, and as you rightly say, often they're not being used, and that's quite important. Susan, but there, of course, what Ian was referring to was, amongst other things, a large number of US corporations. And there's also a question on the Q&A. I mean, to what extent are you and the US business interests looking to impact directly on EU regulation? I mean, the question in my mind is, in the future, what is British business going to be aiming for? They're going to be aiming for the alignment of regulations and standards, which may be very difficult, or are they looking much more to what is effectively the mutual recognition of standards, or indeed the adoption, which we raise in the report? One of the solutions to the problem is elevating the activity in the production of international standards. So instead of having arguments as to whether the European Union is a regulatory superpower or America is a regulatory power, trying to say, well, should we not be trying to achieve international standards? What have you and your members actually been arguing for in the main?
No, it's a really, really good question, and an interesting one, and it probably has evolved over. I haven't been around for those 60 years here at AmCham, pleased to know, but I think it probably has evolved because but I think maybe the most important starting point is that business is not the mouthpiece of the US government. So in answer to that specific question that I did say, it's not like US business is the mouthpiece of, because the government's changing all the time, so it can't be. We work with any US administration. It's really what's in the interest of business rather than what maybe the government wants. And in this case, I think someone alluded to it earlier, the UK government may feel at the moment politically, yes, we want alignment. It may not necessarily be in the interest of business that is the best way forward. It could be mutual recognition. It could be that, again, going back to my point of how much investment there is, in your case, UK companies in Europe, it may be far better for UK business to be aligned with what's happening in the single market. The UK government may not agree, but it could well be in the interest of the business. And I think that's the really important thing, which is why sometimes the US, in our case, the US government may not like everything that US business says over here. We had a case of that last week. You could see there was clearly, why are you saying that, US business? Well, US business, if you go back to some of the stats I gave earlier, Andrew, of how important it is, I've got another one here, 60% of US global investment comes to Europe. And if you go back to my key point of US business does really well here in Europe, what is in their interest? They like the single market. So it's in their interest to conform in line with that. But then you go back to the point of, well, obviously they're going to influence it. They're going to try to influence it in the interest of business. So I hope that's answering the question. So the simple answer to that one is no, it's not a clear. We are not here to lobby on behalf of the US government at all. We have a very good relationship. I think maybe if I can, just to allow, one thing that came up and maybe think of it with the last intervention was how important it is also for US business here. It's US, we often work very closely with Business Europe. I mean, we're often aligned with what Europe and EUROCHAMBRES, it depends. EUROCHAMBRES, I mean, I know Ben, we will exchange, we may do even joint positions on certain piece of legislation because we are aligned. Sometimes we're less aligned with what our mothership, the US Chamber of Commerce in Washington, is saying. So we align closely, we exchange, I have regular calls, but US business in the US may have a different view on things than US business here, because again, it's about this perception and understanding of what's happening here, if that makes sense. And then it goes to your levels of the company, Andrew, and they need some communication within the company on this. Right, that's really interesting. I just want to come to Helen with, actually, Helen, I think there was a very positive commendation for the Scottish Government and the members of the Scottish Parliament in Brussels. I guess they will maintain their activity in Brussels for political reasons we needn't get into. But there's another question there, and I'll make this the final one to the panel before I come to each of you for a, what would you like to be the action point at the #1 priority for British business? But Helen, there was a question about what you and the creative industries are looking for from the UK mission in Brussels. What sort of support do you need and are looking for?
Thank you. Yeah, and I spotted that question because the question also interestingly talks about economic and soft power aspect, which I think is really important in the cultural sectors. I think what our sectors need is really a communication around the messaging, a move away from the Brexit is Brexit and that's it. And I think, even if there is a difficulty, and I can understand there is a conceptual difficulty in the argument that we need to look at this sector by sector. We need a sector-specific approach. I think ultimately, when we review the trade agreement, that's going to inevitably be part of the debate. And I think it's the UK mission's job to really understand, to take on board the sector-specific aspects. And when we're talking about sectors that the EU have specifically recognised as priorities, then to really use that as an advantage. We have in the cultural sectors, one of 14 priority ecosystems for European recovery. That's a key way to continue to underline the importance of sector-specific approaches, and actually just to help being a mouthpiece for the day-to-day reality in the sectors, what's going on, what needs to be done. Is there an alternative way to look at what's happening in Europe today? And I come back to the proposal I mentioned earlier about the cultural area going beyond EU, talking about including all neighbours. I mean, these different approaches, I think, will really help to take the heat out of the EU-UK debate and take a more collective, inclusive approach.
Thank you very much. Okay, time as ever is against us, but I want to come perhaps in the same order as your first opening presentations. I'd ask you each for one action point for the British business community working in Brussels. What would you advocate to them? Perhaps Ben first.
Thanks, Andrew. It's a tricky one. I guess in terms of a specific action point, it would be to pool resources to work together. And Helen mentioned it, and Malcolm referred to it in the chat as well. The Scotland House example as a great best practice that could be considered, I think, on a pan-UK level. But if I can add a couple of other points which are possibly less precise, but I really think that it's time to move on and focus on the practicalities and to work with counterparts from the EU in tackling specific issues within the implementation of the TCA in a pragmatic manner. And to engage with European trade associations on that process, on intel gathering and influencing both parties in that process.
Thank you very much. Susan.
I think it's sort of related to your number 4 in the report, Andrew, but I think I would say a business, it needs a hub. Establish yourself in Brussels, start positioning yourself as a helpful policy partner, if not yet trusted, and not disassociate from the UK mission, but just make sure there's a gap there. You need to build up this constructive tone and voice and demonstrate why the EU benefits from listening to UK business on trade and investment.
Great, thank you, Susan. Ian, what do you think?
I'm a great believer, Andrew, in the notion of a richly imagined future. You describe what you want, and then you try and get yourself towards it and orientate others towards it at the same time. And I think the UK business community, and certainly the food and drink business community, needs to work out very clearly what it wants from the relationship, not just for the next 18 months, but for the next 25 years, decide how they want to run it and begin to move towards it. I think that will help very much in coalescing the forces. But I agree with everything that everyone else has said about the need to establish good organizational hubs here in Brussels, because otherwise we will be at sea forever, because these issues that we're talking about, the protocol, the TAC and so on, they're never going to be resolved properly to our joy. So we need to get what we want. Sisters need to do it for themselves.
Very good. I completely get that. Thank you very much. Leslie. Sorry, Leslie, you're muted at the moment. Would you be kind enough to unmute?
The most commonly made phrase in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
There are 2 points I'd like to make. And one answers one of the questions that was submitted. And it's about maintaining the links with European trade associations. To answer the question, I am vice president of EUCOPE, so I have a very good relationship with them and have done for over 10 years. The second point I would make is this issue of British-based think tanks. We need an objective comment on not just us being seen as having vested interests. We need objective evidence, objective comment from respectable, well thought of think tanks, maybe Low Europe would be a good example. And to produce the evidence helped by us.
Excellent, thank you very much. Yeah, that is a good, we didn't get into the research community, higher education, or the think tanks, but actually we have in the United Kingdom tremendous resources there that just absolutely can be part of the debate in Brussels as much, and should be as much as they are part of the debate in Washington or London. Helen, last but certainly not least.
Okay, so I would pick 2 if that's possible. So number 9, which talks about the key sectors and the need to conduct, regular showcase events, maintain contact. I think I would probably go for a soft power aspect there. I would just underline that I think that needs to be mutual. I think that needs to go both ways for the reasons I mentioned earlier, particularly in the cultural sector, about the importance of the UK market for European creators. So I would say that it's essential that that's a 2-way process. And then I would also pick number 1, again, which is about maximising participation in European trade associations. But again, I would say that has to be mutual. So that needs to go the other way. That European businesses need to be active in Europe, and they need to maintain those relationships and build on soft power. I mean, this is ultimately about promoting relation between the two. So I would pick number 1 and number 9, and I would add that they should be going both ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen. And thank you to all of my panelists this morning. They're excellent contributions, which I think will really repay everybody's watching again, because I think we'll put this up on, it will be available for people to watch and follow, because I think we're starting a debate here. And I think it's a really important one. Can I say, by way of news, the report being available, I sent it yesterday to Tony Danker at the CBI, to Siobhan Haviland at British Chambers of Commerce, to Jonathan Geldart at the Institute of Directors, to Steve Phipson at Make UK, and to Mike Cherry at the Federation of Small Businesses. And I said, why don't we all get together? And I think Ian made a very good point, which is we need a process, but we also need a purpose. We need to say what we're getting together in order to do. And I think the idea that the British business community is capable of fashioning an independent vision of what the future relationship looks like. It serves, I think, the very important purpose of not looking back, not trying to fight the debates, refight the debates of the referendum or post-referendum or the Brexit arguments at all. Let's move on. You know, if we are going to be global Britain, I speak as a UK parliamentarian, if we're going to be global Britain, who are our most important partners in that? Actually, it is still the other European economies. And if we can work together with them, we can have a tremendous positive influence, not only on trade between the United Kingdom and the EU, but actually, as Helen rightly said, on environment and on other issues, tremendously positive impacts on a global basis. So I hope they will respond positively, and that the next report we'll be able to produce is one that takes these ideas and develops those solutions. So maybe the 14 points will turn into 14 chapters of the next report if we can take it forward in that way. But I just want to say thank you to all of our participants. Thank you especially to the team here at Low Europe for their work in the preparation of this report and organising this morning's events. But a very special thank you to all of our interviewees and our panellists this morning. Thank you, all of you, for being with us this morning. It's been great to have you with us. Okay, bye for now, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.